Well, now to a potential milestone in Syria's civil war. Russia is drawing down its forces in Syria, where they've been bolstering the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Now, the two presidents met at a military base there, and Mr. Putin praised his forces for helping to crush what he calls the world's most lethal terrorists, referring, it seems, to ISIS. President Vladimir Putin announced most Russian troops would be leaving soon.
I made a decision that the major part of the Russian military contingent situated in Syria is returning home to Russia. You return with victory to your homeland, to your loved ones, to parents, wives, children, and friends. To the Ministry of Defense, I have given an order to start returning the Russian forces to their permanent bases. The motherland is waiting for you, friends.
Well, Russia was a game changer in the Syrian war. So what does the pullout mean for the conflict? CNN's Paton Walsh is joining us from London. But first, let's go to our Matthew Chance in the Russian capital. And Matthew, this was an unannounced visit to Syria by the Russian president. You spoke about the success of the campaign. Just give us a sense of what this means for Russia's standing in the Middle East.
Well, I think it's potentially quite significant, and I think the fact that we saw Vladimir Putin unexpectedly popping up in Syria on state television here in Russia, congratulating the troops, announcing a partial withdrawal of Russian forces, was, in part playing to his domestic audience, but in part playing to the wider region as well, because I think it shows that Russia believes it has achieved its military objectives in Syria. First of all, it's bolstered its ally Bashar al-Assad, prevented President Assad from being defeated by his enemies and opponents. Secondly, Russia has managed to not just maintain its military footprint in Syria, but to expand that footprint as well. It's consolidated its military bases at Tartus and at Latakia. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it's delivered this message that Russia is a real power broker in the region. And that's the message that Vladimir Putin wants to communicate so badly to other regional leaders. And it's why he moved on from this whirlwind trip to Syria, immediately on to Cairo, where he's been meeting President Sisi of Egypt, discussing greater cooperation with the Egyptians. And then later on tonight, he's going to Turkey, where we'll be meeting President Erdogan as well. And so this is an important sort of moment of victory for the Russians that Vladimir Putin is desperate to capitalize on.
Absolutely. Well, just stand by for us, Matthew. I want to bring in Paton Walsh. Nick, this decision by Russia to begin withdrawing troops from Syria comes just a day after Iraq said essentially that the war against ISIS in Iraq is over. So what does this all mean for the fight against terror in the region?
Well, certainly the Kremlin are using this moment of a broader sense of the ISIS campaign winding down slowly to harness it for their own political gain. Vladimir Putin facing re-election uncontested, more or less, in literally a matter of months' time. And he has in the past suggested a lessening of the truth presence there. We'll have to see if this really actually does happen, as he says. But as you point out, this is about messaging that a war and involvement militarily that was not always enormously popular, increasingly less so in Russia, is coming to an end to some degree. But the key hidden headline here are these two now permanent bases. They always had a naval base at Tartus. They'll now have a permanent presence in Hamaim, an air base there. That is significant because it provides them broader reach across Syria and Iraq more generally. Now, in Iraq itself, we are, of course, seeing the campaign against ISIS, as you said, announced literally in the last few days as being over. And in Syria, too, it's very much coming to its final close. There's no real, I think it's fair to say, broader government across the country to call that moment when it's over like there is in Iraq. But we've seen the regime advance heavily around Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor as well. We've seen Raqqa fall to US-backed Kurdish forces. There are many ISIS militants somewhere in that northern desert that still potentially have to be tackled or may come back to haunt whoever controls that territory now. But that ISIS campaign is slowly winding down. But, Lynda, bear in mind, this isn't the end of the trouble inside Syria. There are many questions left to answer. What happens to the rebels against the Assad regime? What happens to the Kurds who are fighting with the US? Do they have a comfortable accommodation with the Syrian regime going forwards? And does the Syrian regime feel the territory it holds now is really enough, or do they still have further ambitions? Lynda?
Yeah, certainly many more questions, Nick. I just want to go back to Matthew Chance for a moment to look at what this means for President Putin's political standing on the home front, given this was the biggest intervention in the Middle East by Russia in decades. How is this paying off for President Putin at home?
Well, I think it's been pretty positive. It's been one of the most positive aspects of his period of rule over the past couple of years. I mean, the adventure in Syria was a high-risk strategy from a Russian domestic political point of view. It could have gone catastrophically wrong. The Russian forces could have suffered immense losses, and they could have, failed in their objective of supporting their ally there, Bashar al-Assad. None of that happened. I mean, there have been military losses, but they've been pretty minimal. Certainly in political terms here in Russia, there's not a massive public outcry at the amount of Russian forces that have been lost in supporting Bashar al-Assad. And of course, Putin was very smart about keeping his objectives very, very narrow, not engaging in any kind of nation-building campaign like the United States attempted to in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but merely narrowing it down to that, support our ally Bashar al-Assad and bolster Russia on the international stage. He's done both of those things, and that's gone down brilliantly with the Russian public.
All right, Matthew Chance for us in Moscow and Nick Paton Walsh for us in London. Great to have you both with us. Thank you.